the institutional, legal, and governmental arrangements. People often imagine that democracies are capitalist, and not democracies are not capitalist. But what the fuck are you talking about? The logic of capitalism has spun its web holistically across the globe. Governments, no matter what their form, engage in it. They have to. The Soviet Russia could have been an entirely different thing without the imposition of capital and colonialism and empire. In terms of institutions and legal situations, the legal situation is entirely sophisticated bourgeois infrastructure focused on defending private property. In terms of institutions, you've got the sort of the contemporary versions of the Bretton Woods ones are like the sort of the prominent things, the World Bank and the WTO, World Trade Organization. Where's my mind today? What an awful moment for me for it to take a vacation. And I mean, there's the sort of, I don't know where we are today with them. I know a few years ago they began sort of emphasizing inequality. But say like they're sort of, when they really came into their own was like during the 80s and the Chicago school thing, running around the world, indebting, inverted commas, developing countries into the system. You can have all this aid, but it's all highly conditional. So I mean, this is how the sort of how they fast tracked the logic of capitalism in some countries, gave them a heap of cash, but sort of made sure that what was done alongside and with that cash was that it would come quickly shooting back out into the hands of those that gave it in the first place, but along with literally any other residual wealth that it could sort of capture.
Sure, and I guess it's locking you into that into that logic. I guess if you have a ton of conditional capital kind of foisted, happily or seemingly happily foisted upon you, obviously for a lot of people or societies or communities that appears to be, oh, brilliant, now we can produce, we can innovate, we can do all that stuff. But obviously, as you pointed out, those conditionals then sort of dictate, or I would assume, and again, this is coming at it from a very limited understanding of some of the topics that we touch on specifically regarding things like economics. But I would based on some of the previous points we've made about understanding, how certain logics can be kind of instigated or like implemented, I guess, into one psyche. I guess on a grander level, I could see absolutely how something like the known, like understanding that underneath all of your innovation is this like large pot of debt, would begin to, I guess, decide how you began to innovate. Because obviously the idea is that you need to be able to make back, you need to be able to fulfill that debt, and also fulfill whatever extras that are meant to go along with that. But at the same time, you probably still want to see something for all your fucking efforts to innovate society. So maybe, I don't know, it's a theory, I'm pulling this out of my ass, but it could be
it's not bad.
It locks you into the idea of how you would have to innovate. So your decisions are already, in theory, made for you by the fact that you took the debt in the first place.
That's the power of the logic, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's bollocks.
No. I
Yeah.
mean, 'cause that's one perfect way of putting one of the elements. Like for the initial investor, you give someone cash and you tell them you want it back, and and give them a sort of a roadmap on how to do that. They are no, never mind them, but that money's been given to someone. They set up all this stuff. Um, it's used basically to create surplus. We see it here in the UK in the third sector, where the government, the Tories, are trying to, or they were until the the world ended, sort of marketize the third sector. So obviously, like the third sector lives on grants and funding schemes, but I can't remember the term of it, but it was social lending basically. That might actually be the term for it. I was at a conference and about funding, and there was a Tory minister. I can't remember who it was, but he was there saying like, "Oh yes, we give the this is what we want to see basically." And everyone else then talked about, okay, social lending's amazing, blah 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 blah. But before I elaborate what that blah 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 was, the last person who spoke was from Leeds, and he was amazing. He said, no, actually, we've done none of this. We've like self-funded, and we've put in asset-based community development. We've really sort of mobilized the inherent resources in the community, and the pictures he was putting up on the slides was this like totally idiosyncratic, heterogeneous, colorful, people-based picture of community development. The blah 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 from everyone else before him were the recipients of social lending, and they all described situations which basically they got a million. You know, they got a loan. They got lots of money in a loan, a low interest loan. But the conditions that came with that loan necessitated, like the pictures that they were looking, they were all big red brick dull buildings with a community center inside and a fucking Spar or a Costa on the corner. Absolutely. And this is their model. So the it's a social enterprise. Yeah. Excuse me. The money, totally homogenous. Everyone who works in the shop, the profits from the shop sort of help sustain the community center. Every person that's you're employing people in the community, but every person that's like making fucking minimum wage and aspire close enough to minimum wage, the way capitalism works is like whatever profit happens, and so profit from that instance is going into the community center, but ultimately it's a spar and it's a business, and surplus value, the margin is still the fucking top dog, and that margin represents surplus value. It's value from nothing. It's value on top of the value that's being created by the actual producers, the people serving people in a marketplace, and it's being siphoned out of the community, and it's undermining the wages of the people earning those wages. So it's no community development whatsoever. So you bring that back to the 80s, to Africa, to Latin America, with not the World Bank. It's the other way around, isn't it? The WTO is like a bank and the World Bank is like a trading organization. So the WTO go around giving these loans, putting the money in. Basically, the money flushes through the system and rinses everything. It's just you shove the money into every crevice. You go, here, you can do that. Here, you can do that, and people make a business out of it. They have to give the loan back through the surplus value that they've made, because of probably high interest on those loans, and there's no sustainable business put in place. There's no sustainable economy put in place, but the money fucking comes back out of it, and it just washes everything and transforms everything, and then the wealth from that area is extracted. I believe this is neo-colonialism, and instead of holding a gun to your face, and but that's what Meekson's Wood was saying. It's in like sort of like the pre-capitalist. I mean, I know early colonialism was still tied to capitalism, but they were getting away with plenty of extra economic ways of colonialism, just brutal wealth extraction. But because capitalism spins its logic, neocolonialism is this strictly economic way of extracting wealth, and getting people. Obviously, the person who facilitates it, the local person, gets well looked after, but nothing compared to the full extraction of the wealth in that local area. Another interesting institutional development actually is the EU. I think there was a guy released from Mussolini's jails, Speroni might have been his name, after the war, and he was a federalist, and he was sort of like, of course, the EU, the roots of the EU started in the wake of the war, and it was a purely economic situation there with coal and steel agreements for the rebuilding of Europe. And I think by the 50s, I think he was sort of like drawn in by his mates, like, come on, come down to this club we've got and see what you got to say. But basically, I can't remember the details, but his perspective, I think he was jailed by Mussolini for being a federalist, and possibly, like, when I say federalist there, it might have been verging towards sort of anarcho-syndicalism. But his vision for Europe would have been a sort of a national federation. I mean, in terms of how to say these things in that given moment, it could have been regional, it could have been industrial. But his view was a main trunk of political possibility in the EU at that time, and it wasn't until the voting processes continued and the development continued to the 70s when neoliberalism, obviously, really sort of, the economic principles started impinging and pushing this socio-political or social political possibilities out. And it was not the Lisbon Treaty, the Maastricht Treaty in the 90s that consolidated this decision. So you got that 15-20 year period, or you got like a 15-20 year period before where that was a real possibility, an equal possibility, and then you've got a 15-20 year period where that was slowly waning and being pushed out, and then Maastricht made the EU and consolidated this neoliberal institutional form that we're still developing today. But I mean, like, the alternative potentials, it was really sad to sort of come across that. But anyway, we're talking about the power of the logic, how it's moving through each moment, and the institutional, legal, and governmental arrangements. So returning to that volunteer body, I think, is a really good part. With this respect, we have a legal situation, like we've already described, that, if sustained, will allow the institution and governmental arrangements to continue along this pathway to barbarism. Corporations have turnovers higher than, or wealth bases higher than many countries. With the capitalist logic, this is where the power resides. Back to Bezos, his firing of staff members of late for trying to organize employees to along the lines of their actual existing rights, was illegal. The firing was illegal. It was against the local laws and regulations. And who gives a shit? Who gives a shit? So we're still on the path to barbarism here. The legal institutions that, while yes, they emphasize the protection of private property, labor is property. The welfare of the individual is still protected under the legal system, but because of the institutional and governmental arrangements where national states are suppressed by powerful private lobbies, there's different ways of defining institutions, but this is certainly one of them, the deeper, less formal institution of fucking giving a shit about people is being suppressed by this process, where governments are being diminished by governments and the legal through the total ineffectiveness of that legal situation. The new institutionalization of not giving a shit about people is being enacted, and like as we touched on in the last two chats, we're moving here towards a sort of a neo-feudalism. Amazon is extracting rents rather than wealth from innovative and efficient production. They are being barbarous to their employees. They're extracting wealth through extra economic means in that sense. In the wider system, people becoming so indebted that accumulation through dispossession, while it's economic, is veering towards like a degree of we might have said this before we hit record, but the whereas a capitalist system will always boom and bust, any capitalist economist will agree that in a bust you throw cash at the situation, in a boom you extract the cash. But neoliberalism has come to such a point where in the last 10 years in a bust the wealth is extracted even further. It's just not capitalism. That's punitive. That's extra economic, or veering towards it. Like what's the economic sense, or at least what's the capitalist economic sense there? There is none. This is sort of the barbaric situation along this moment that we're moving towards. And I think I don't know, is it oh yeah so the first sort of like the ideal, the socialist sort of alternative in terms of the governmental arrangement, that body of volunteers, Fisher and Mouffe talked about the not the withering of the state, but living state, being state, becoming state, instead of bureaucratization, democratization, seeing state as branches of functions that are localized. But if you sort of allow access to those local public services, say for instance, Corbyn got in, things were renationalized, public services were fit for purpose once more, properly funded, then local, like the service users in any given situation were given access to running those services. This is that body of volunteers. So through that human compassion, driven to volunteer, but the base. So I mean, 1.5 million is a heavily expanded base. So imagine that across many frontiers. Just expand the base of volunteers, the body of volunteers, and then invert it. Democratize the access to provisions that they have, so that they're not just merely helping agencies run them, but actually running them themselves. And you've got a situation where communities are the state, where state was a collectivized block of power, has been drawn down, and is now being that's the state. What you imagine as a nation state is now just a federation of community states being run by people. I mean, of course, there's networks of communication that will sort of replicate a hierarchical situation. I would imagine you still got to there still has to be national level organization, but this is the alternative logic that you run to sort of to move along that moment, to achieve your fundamental change.